So welcome back, everybody. Season 2 is on and strong on our podcast vlog thingy. We still haven't decided what we're doing.
Yeah, we don't have to fit in a box, which
We
is a
don't.
perfect segue to the series topic for the season.
Yes. So for season 2, Lani and I have been talking about breaking through bureaucracy, sort of navigating those boxes that DRK-12 awardees or prospective DRK-12 awardees may run into as they are both developing their projects and their proposals, but then also trying to implement their projects and their proposals.
So our first episode was about project management, and today
we get to talk about the money.
Show me the money.
I don't know. Look, in my mind, I went back to Motown, and it was like the best things in life are free.
Da-da-da-da.
But something is what I want. Money.
But you can give them to the birds and the bees.
The birds and the bees. Yes, thank you. Look, I love this partnership because we can fill in the missing lyrics. But we're talking about money, budgets, budget allocations, and the trickiness in thinking about budgets, both in terms of developing proposals for DRK-12, but then for those who are awarded proposals, some considerations that come post-award. And I like this episode too, Lani, because it's not just us, although we're phenomenal, but we actually got to hear from some experts in the room, NSF program officers and program leads.
Yeah, so I spoke with Toya Frank, who is program director. She's a program officer and in the Directorate of STEM Education, and she's also in the Division of Research on Learning, also known as DRL, around these parts. She's also the co-lead on the Racial Equity and STEM Education program.
Mm-hmm. And I got the chance to speak with Osley Sezenberry, who by the time that this comes out will be the former lead of the DRK-12 program, but at the time was current lead and holding down the fort in terms of helping us see all of these phenomenal awards come through. But one of the first questions that we thought that was very important in just asking questions about budgets and budget allocations were questions around like advice that our program directors and program officers would have for prospective principal investigators on budget design. And in sort of looking across and thinking with our respondees, one of the first things that really stood out to us was checking out the PAPPG, the program solicitation, and being in communication with your program officers. So what was that experience like for you in terms of just thinking about the PAPG, the solicitation, and even access to program officers?
Yeah, I think I didn't really understand when I was a new PI how central the PAPG was and just how many of the questions I had could be answered there. It's a pretty intimidating document because it's really dense and it looks like one of those terms of service agreements you might just click on without reading when you're trying to download software. But there's actually hidden in there a lot of really important information. So one thing I've learned to do as a PI or when I'm trying to prepare an award is I'll open the PAPG document online and then search for terms. So I don't have to try to read through it because it's not actually very readable, to be honest. But it does often have answers to questions and it does get updated periodically. So sometimes just because you used to know the answer to a question doesn't mean that you still know the answer to a question, and that PAPG is the place where you could find that out. How about you, Terrell?
Very similar experience. Having the PAPG open, looking through what is discussed in terms of budget and budget justifications, always sort of cross-referencing. Like you, I haven't just sat down and tried to read it cover for cover, because it is a long and somewhat dense read, but having that control find and being able to go specifically to sections around what is allowable cost in budgets. How should I be thinking about, the difference between what's allocated to personnel versus participant support versus other direct costs like resources and materials and incentives and such. That document has been very helpful. And also the program solicitation, because each program has its own flair to it. And so there'll be very specific criteria that will be expected in the proposal that would have to also be reflected in the budget in terms of thinking about your actual research design or program design.
Yeah, because a lot of DRK-12 folks might be applying for racial equity grants, for ITEST grants, for other grants across the DRL directorate. So if you're not squarely in, especially maybe if you're in a new program, it's worth going and looking at the solicitation to make sure you're meeting the right criteria.
Mm-hmm. And what was really interesting in talking with Osley about the DRK-12 solicitation specifically is like there were two things that stood out. One of the things I can kind of just report on, but the other I really do want to cut to her because she gave a very good explanation. But one of the things that she talked about is that, in thinking about the fact that DRK-12, our primary participants are going to be like teachers and students and school administrators, is really paying attention to what the solicitation says around how to engage those people. And so as you're thinking about your budgets and recognizing the different power that people may have because of the fact that they are an administrator versus a teacher versus a student, you really want to pay attention to what's in the solicitation around budget allocations for those groups, particularly for DRK-12, so that you are in compliance with what the solicitation is saying. And I know we have more to dive into around payments and such, which we'll get into a little later. But the second thing, though, that I thought that was really powerful that I do want to cut to Osley on is thinking intentionally about the relationship between the different levels of DRK-12 projects and how we think about budgets. And so let's see what Osley was talking about here when she referenced levels and budgets.
One of the things that you might know this very well, we have levels that's also defined in our solicitation, right? Like level 1, level 2, level 3, and that basically levels are defined based on how much time your project needs, what extent of the team you need to put together, and you basically decide on the level based on those criteria. And they're mostly independent of our project types. There are a couple project types, like synthesis is an example, that has their own certain budget allocation, but levels are typically picked not based on the project type, but based on what timeline you need, what project staff you need, etc. So what we see as a question that comes to a lot of our program officers is that, so what should be my budget? They ask us basically, and then we can tell them the upper limits that we have for these levels that are stated in our solicitation. Like, for example, level 2 has a cap at like $3 million. And then you would see also sometimes people would put a budget that's like almost very close to $3 million because they're like just thinking about, this is the money I have, let's try to put all like materials, etc., like more staff. That's that thinking. We sometimes feel like that actually has a somewhat negative impact on the project itself, because what we actually hope that PIs think about what my project needs first. What do I need to successfully carry out this project? What is the time and scope that I need to complete this project? What are the materials I need? What are the participants I need? And put that together and then see basically what is the amount they're coming at, and then think about what levels then I can fit into, if this makes sense, and then perhaps reevaluate. So just starting with, this is the money I have, I'm going to randomly, I mean, I'm not saying maybe 100% random, but, starting there can actually lead to not thoroughly thinking what project needs. So that's something we commonly see, and I just wanted to make sure I highlight it because it's related to the levels that we describe in the solicitation. And then one other thing that a lot of our program officers see is when people start working on their budget kind of really late in the process. Because again, budget is something, you start working on, you want to justify your budget items, and then you want to perhaps reevaluate as you finish up your proposal. And that's why you want to start working on your budget earlier, especially if you're working on a collaborative project with with other institutions involved.
So yeah,
Yeah,
that's
that's
really
really,
important
really
information.
helpful. And one of the things that Toya said to me, which I think relates a little bit to what Osley's saying there, is she says that especially new PIs or people who are newcomers to NSF, she's seen people make the mistake to not ask for the money they need to do the work and
Mhm.
think that if they ask for less money, they'll have a better chance of being funded. And she just wants to dispel that idea, because in reality, the POs and the reviewers and so on are looking to make sure that the budget you ask for fits the work you plan to do.
Mhm. And so I think that's a very important staple. The budget you ask for needs to fit the work that you plan to do. And this accounts for the different levels that are represented in DRK-12. And it also accounts for minimums and maximums. Some people may go in thinking that they just need to max out their budgets, when in reality, your scope of work may not fit a maxed out budget. And then, like Toya shared, some people may think, well, if my budget is lesser than, then I'm guaranteed to get the funding. But if that lesser budget doesn't fit your scope of work, then that's actually going to be counted against you in terms of thinking holistically across both scope of work and funding and people and things like that.
Yeah, which actually is a nice segue into our second theme, which is thinking about allocations of money and time. This is where we got a little bit into the weeds with the program officers that we spoke with about some of the kinds of things that people might over budget for or under budget for. And Toya said that in her experience as a program officer, she sees people tending to underestimate things like salaries, and particularly new PIs will underestimate the kinds of people power that they'll need to get their work done. Like, especially if you're coming out of a doctoral program and this is your first research project where you're going to be the PI. When you were a doctoral student doing your dissertation, that was your job. That was your whole job. And you weren't trying to teach courses, advise students, do all the service work you have to do as a professor, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's a little bit of an adjustment to imagine that if you want to interview every middle school teacher in a district, that maybe that shouldn't be entirely on your shoulders. Maybe you should get a doctoral student or two or a consultant to help you with some of the analyses, but to really think about the bandwidth that you have versus other people you might need to bring in to get the work done.
If I can lean into that a little bit, even though this is not NSF specific, it's this idea of really thinking about balance between what is, as an assistant professor or research scientist, or whatever sort of designation that you have with your organization or institution, but like, what is that balance between the work that you have to do on this one specific project versus all of your other professional responsibilities? And I know that as like a new tenure track faculty, on a traditional appointment, and I say traditional as in 40-40-20, 40% research, 40% teaching, 20% service, that we tend to find in our Research One institutions, that 40% research is only 40% of your professional responsibilities.
Exactly.
Allegedly, in air quotes.
Allegedly.
Allegedly. Right. But yeah, trying to balance that with the other responsibilities can cause a person to not think about the fact that because I'm used to, like you said, being the sole person doing the research, as compared to having to manage both researcher responsibilities and now administrative responsibilities that comes with having a grant, in addition to all of my other responsibilities, having that kind of team to carry out the work is definitely going to be important.
Yeah, that's really helpful to hear your perspective on that as someone who is currently an assistant professor. I want to turn to Toya about a particular category that she sees people under budgeting with. You know, Toya is a former teacher. She taught for 10 years. She does a lot of work with teachers around issues like racial equity. And so she has some pretty clear views about that. She sees proposals that under budget participant honoraria, especially for teachers, but also for students and other participants. So let's cut to her.
I often find that PIs have to be very careful not to under budget like participant honoraria. You want to, particularly teachers. I know some districts have policies around, what is allowable for teacher support, but when possible, even for students, just think about the intellectual, sometimes emotional, given the topics, the amount of labor that your participants are putting forth. So, you'd want to be sure to offer them something that feels like like you're appreciative of their time and effort that they're putting into the work, because they're providing all the data for the project. So that's another place where I think I often see some underestimation, and travel is an overestimation.
That's very important to consider, especially in these times. And I say these times as in like sort of this post-COVID world that we're operating within. A lot of people don't consider, or I'm not going to say don't, previously did not consider that social emotional impact that's connected to the work. And, there's a difference between like the amount of time that a person needs to spend thinking and reading and preparing for something, and then the time that they actually may spend collecting something. And if we're only focusing on the time that a person is spending collecting something, all of that additional intellectual, emotional labor may not be appropriately accounted for in our budgets and our considerations.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that this moment in history, in US history, we really need to have special awareness of what we're asking of people.
Especially if people have lesser power than those of us who might be writing these grants. So even as an assistant professor, I have certain power that has been endowed to me as a faculty member that a graduate student may not have, or that a research scientist may not have, or a teacher or administrator whose boots on the ground everyday experience may be impacted by, other systems and other policies and other structures that are less flexible than what we may see in our research-based organizations and institutions.
Yeah. The other thing that Toya told me tends to be overestimated was travel. And she sees this come out in the budget justifications that aren't specific enough about explaining the anticipated costs and the need for the different trips. So the budget justification is something we should really talk about, because that's where you translate to the reviewers, to the POs, program officer, POs, why you're asking for the amount of money that you're asking for.
And one of the things that Osley mentioned in terms of budget justification, again, part summary, part maybe cut to her, is the fact that that's the space where you can really explain all of those sort of behind the scene, logics, schemas, strategies, however you want to define it, in terms of how and why you're making certain decisions in terms of what you're doing, where you're going, and how you're doing it. I know personally, on that concept of travel, my justifications have had to have somewhat of a formula, in a sense, where it's this is the projected cost for flights to this area. This is the number of people that may be taking flights. This is the projected cost per night at a hotel for these amount of nights. And so like literally having that level, that granular level of breakdown that's connected to why I'm taking a professional trip is important. But even outside of like travel, that same sort of granular breakdown in terms of what is the percentage of my time that I'm allocating? What is that conversion to person months? Because NSF loves person month in terms
The
of
only organization I've ever worked with where I've had to calculate person months is the National Science Foundation.
Yes, and that's a interesting, fun. That was a memeable moment there, Lani. Another classic. But yeah, so thinking about that, and not just for my time, but for collaborators and even partners. And so I kind of want to cut to Osley right quick as she talks a little bit about those sort of allocations and strategies in the budget justification as you're thinking about timing and such. So when scholars are looking to develop a research project and they're looking to develop a budget, and I'm new to this, do I just go in and say, hey, you know, it's going to take me all of my time to do this work. And so now I have to pay myself 100% of my salary to do this work? Or are there restrictions or limitations or challenges that you've seen there when it comes to how people actually divvy up payments in budget for time that they're working towards the project or time that other PIs or personnels might be working towards the project?
So just to clarify, Terrell, you're referring to post-award, right? Like, you know, what post-award, how they're going to think about budgeting, you know, their own time, right?
Well, in terms of pre-award, so if I'm developing my budget, and let's say that my annual salary is $100,000, do I write in for myself $100,000 for my salary in my budget because I'm the person that's doing the work? Or are there restrictions that NSF places on how much I could pay myself or how much I could pay someone else that causes me to have to think about, you know, what is the amount of time and the level and all of these other factors that I should consider when developing the budget?
Sure, there are restrictions. And I think fortunately and unfortunately, you know, well, you can, it's a project that you like, you care about, you can spend, you may want to spend your, let's say, 50% of your time. But for example, for the universities, the higher education institutions, we have a 2-month cap that you can only pay for 2 months of your salary. And if there is any reason, which becomes, you know, a rare case, if there's any reason you need to ask for more than that, let's say you have really a huge load on the project, and your expertise and your you know, what you can do, like maybe something that requires a lot of traveling around and you're the only one who can do it. And for those cases, you can ask for a justification, but even those, like, you know, we don't want it like something like 50% of your time. So, and the reason for, you know, these kind of limitations is that we don't want, you know, senior personnel in most of our projects. Like I'm gonna exclude the career awards because they are single PI awards. So other than that, we want our projects to be true partnerships. We think that a lot of the the work that contributes to the field actually happens when you can bring on people from different spaces with different expertise and leverage their work skillfully to completing the project's activities. So, you know, that's why there's a lot of restriction on how much the senior personnel can get paid out of their time. And of course, it's rated towards their, you know, salaries, but even then, you know, how much time you want to put is restricted by NSF. But you want to also be careful on not putting too little of your time if you have a lot of overseeing of the project activities.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So it's like a balance, and people should be thinking about what is that balance between the time, like number of hours or minutes that I invest, my salary and what that means in terms of that 2-month cap if I work within a university space, and then my collaborators, how each of us are bringing different types of expertise to the project so that we can be very intentional to demonstrate from a budget stance that we are all, invested in this project and we're all being compensated for the work that we're doing. And it doesn't just come across as, again, excluding careers, right? One person really just trying to take over, I guess you can say.
Yeah, once again, there is a lot of value bringing, expertise, knowledge across different spaces or expertise. So, I think having this cap then helps to be able to bring in those variety of expertise.
Got you.
Yeah, I'm on a PI on a project right now where I'm in charge of a 20-person team. So I have asked for a little bit more than the 2-month cap, with the justification that I just have a lot of people management. And as a PI, I also have to do like quality control of the publications and data collection. And like there's certain kinds of project management that you can't, it really is required of one person who's looking across the whole enterprise. That is an example of when you might ask to exceed that 2-month maximum.
And just as a reminder, that administrative component is only one portion of your responsibilities.
That's right. I'm also in the field collecting data and interviewing teachers and doing PD, and yes. Yes.
So but being formulaic is important in thinking about all the responsibilities and then being transparent about that formula in your justification is going to be key as decisions are being made about how and why you're asking for certain amounts with respect to your different budget categories.
That's right.
That also makes me think about the next question that we kind of pursued with them, which was really focused on like challenges that they've seen, both pre-award and sort of post-award with budgets that have been implemented. And so I don't know, like what were some of the challenges that Toya kind of articulated as you were talking with her?
Well, again, I think because Toya works a lot in the racial equity space, she sees a lot of folks who are really new to NSF. So they may be community nonprofits who are used to working with smaller funding agencies. So there's some NSF specific things that are maybe more taken for granted by those of us who've been on NSF projects like since we've been in our graduate years, but that are a little peculiar in the broader world of funding. For example, she talks about the need to align the budget with the NSF budget template. And she also points out if you find yourself in the category of somebody who is brand new to the NSF, that there are some budget webinars that are really helpful for just getting started and getting oriented, and that do more of that work than we're doing here in this production. How about you? Did Osley have things to talk about with people preparing NSF budgets and grants?
Yeah. It was a little bit more specific, I would say, to thinking about the actual sort of breakdown in your budget. So one of the things that Osley leaned into was really thinking about the difference between like participant support costs and like some of those other direct costs. And so as we think about within the DRK-12 space, we may have projects that have aspects like professional developments for teachers. And so that professional development, Osley would associate with like a participant support cost. They're actively engaged in the programming that's happening through our projects. And so any sort of related funding connected to that professional development might be aligned with participant support costs. But then, like, if we're actually asking those same teachers to be interviewed, to do focus groups, or to do things that are research related, and we're thinking about compensating them for their research, that's a different kind of cost that has a different kind of budget line item that's not in the participant support cost. And so even if we have people engaged in both programmatic activities and research activities, being intentional to think about the timing that we're asking of them to make sure that the compensation is appropriate, and then also thinking budget-wise where that compensation needs to be put was something that Osley really talked about as some of those common challenges that she and other program officers have noticed in thinking pre-award side, how participants and such are discussed within budgets and justifications. And I feel like Toya had something around like participants as well, if I remember you sort of sharing that with me.
Yeah, no, let's turn to Toya, because I think she has a really clear perspective on where NSF lands when it comes to these issues.
Let's say you aren't spending the way you thought you would spend. Now, I will be pretty frank. Putting money into participant costs, not a problem. Hi, Toya. I haven't been able to spend on participant costs. I can't get enough interviewees. Can we use this money to go to AERA? That requires some additional paperwork.
Gotcha. Okay, that's really clear.
Yeah, NSF is pretty pro participants. So if you want to use money like to take them to a conference or to expand your interview pool, those sorts of things, that's just very different from saying you want to pull money from participants.
Gotcha.
That's just one example.
Okay.
So I think that's a very important thing to note. Like in our research projects, how are we intentional in our budgets to invest in our participants? Yeah, particularly in DRK-12, where we know we're working with teachers, we're working with students, we might even be working with families in some of these spaces, and really making sure that people are compensated equitably is what I think both of us would argue.
Yeah.
In either that support cost or that research incentive cost.
And I think it's also important in the DRK-12 space because a lot of times the arguments people make about having a broader impact involves their direct work with those participants and communities. So if that is a part of your project goal, then people should be compensated for helping you meet those goals. How about
really quickly?
Well, I'm sorry.
Though, I was just going to ask, because, and we could try to hit a couple of points, because Osley had mentioned this book. But what are some of those ways that people might think about equitable compensation for like teachers or students in your experience?
Yeah, Toya talked about how that different districts sometimes have rules about teacher compensation. So, for example, if there's a strong union that requires a certain amount of compensation for PD, or maybe places limits on the amount that teachers can be compensated to, for equity reasons within the district itself. Those are things that PIs should look out for. But oftentimes people can be creative and find other means of compensation, whether it's buying things for classrooms or, gift cards, which are obviously not ideal, but they do avoid some taxation things. So those are things to ask other PIs who've worked in your setting. If you have folks like at your university or at your research institute that have worked with those partners before, they might have some ideas.
Yeah, I think one of the things that stood out to me that Osley has shared is like, you could also think about paying for substitutes for teachers.
Yes.
If you're thinking about teachers taking time to participate in some of these endeavors, their classrooms still have to move forward as those students still need to learn.
Yeah.
And so there could be an opportunity to actually pay for that substitute in addition to compensating that teacher, recognizing that the equity issue isn't just pay, but it's time and resources and things of that nature.
Yeah, but always make sure that the districts you're working with have an adequate substitute pool, before you put that in your grant, because that is also a post-COVID issue, is that a lot of substitute pools have been declining.
But you were going to post award before I cut in, though.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, let's shift over to post award. Did Osley have anything to talk about specifically with post award issues?
She did, and I mean, it's back to that participant support cost. So you got the money and you realize that sometimes you budgeted things that didn't make sense, and you might need to do some money moving. One of the things that Osley emphasized is that NSF, without approval from your program officers, does not allow moving of funds from participant support costs. Going back to something that you said that Toya shared, really investing in that participant support, trying to take money from participants to allocate to personnel time or travel time or resources is not something that NSF would, I'm going to say in air quotes, consider without at least, a logical justification that has to be written in and formally approved by NSF.
Yeah, Toya said something like that if you're in doubt, just reach out to your program officer. In my experience, my program officers have been really responsive, and you can usually learn the best way to reach them. Email is usually the best channel because it all goes through NSF. And if you have a question, don't be embarrassed about it. They would rather you did your due diligence before you shift categories of budgets than didn't. And the other things she mentioned, like on a larger scale, so those are sort of the micro decisions about like, oh, we have this much allocated for this category and we want to shift it over here. But sometimes over the course of a year of a project, you'll find that you are either overspending or underspending your projected budget. And so to really think of your annual report as a communication mechanism between the PIs, the principal investigators, and the POs, the program officers. So you can communicate the reason for those discrepancies. For example, the first year of the current project I'm in, we ended up underspending on travel because of our teachers' desire to stay remote a little bit longer. So we were doing more Zoom meetings than in-person meetings. So that makes sense, but I just need to explain it to my program officer so that they don't think I was like padding the budget in some other way, but that this actually made sense. And it wasn't that I had miscalculated my budget. It's just that in real life, the world turned out to be a little different than we anticipated, which the program officers totally understand because in DRL, we're doing work with humans and in the social world, and it's a lot of unanticipated things are going to come up.
Yeah, I actually kind of learned something myself from this because even though in doing annual reports and trying to be very intentional about project activities, I guess, thinking about the connection again between the project activities and the budget is very key. Because as we enter into sort of the completion of our projects or the end of our grants, there's always this question of like no cost extensions, or are there supplemental needs that I may have because I haven't projected fully for things that I can account for. And so having that connection to that annual report and being intentional to talk about that decision-making process in terms of shifts that you may have made as very, very important and another line of communication between you and the program officers.
So let's talk about no cost extensions and supplements. I think that those are two really important mechanisms for PIs to understand. And from talking to Toya and from looking at your conversation with Osley, it sounds like they're often confused. So let's get super clear about what a no-cost extension is and what a supplement is and what the rules are around those.
Yeah, so I think my conversation with Osley around this concept of no cost extensions and supplements started with like rumors that I had heard. And so I was like, here's a rumor that I've heard, and what are your thoughts and your responses to it? So like one of the rumors that I had heard is that if I hadn't spent my money, I was going to create a whole word. If I haven't spent my money, then that no cost extension gives me the opportunity to spend my money, even if I've already kind of completed all of my project endeavors. And so now I'm trying to think of what are all these other kind of new things that I could do to spend my money. And that, as you shared, was like no, that is not how the no cost extension works. Owsley was very intentional to talk about no cost extensions being connected to the completion of your initial project ideas. Did Toya say anything similar?
Absolutely. In fact, let's cut to her because she's pretty clear about it. Let's talk a little bit about no cost extensions.
Yeah. All right. So no cost extensions. This is where I wanted to get the exact language. So no cost extensions, different from supplements. No cost extensions mean there is money remaining in your budget and you need more time to carry out proposed work. It doesn't mean I have more money. The need to do the work has to supersede the amount, the fact that you have money remaining, because you do not have to have a zero balance. But when there's work remaining that needs to be done and the funds are there, you take a no cost extension to continue to carry out your work. The first one is really low stakes. Program officers get noticed, but for the most part, they are grantee initiated and they move through quickly. Beyond that, because I, as a program officer, I'm like, I see it, I approve it, I think it is fine. Beyond that first one, the Division of Grants Administration gets involved when they go beyond the first time. Given the context, no cost extensions happen. So sometimes people reach out to us almost in an apologetic stance. There's no reason. Things happen. Remember, proposals are proposing work,
right?
Like that you hope happens. But when you are doing work in the real world, particularly work with people,
right?
Things happen and change, and sometimes you need more time to carry out your proposed work.
As Toya is really clear, the no cost extension means that money remains and you need more time to carry out your proposed work. It's not different work. It's not new work. You need another year to achieve the goals of your project. So there's two things to think about when you're comparing no cost extensions and supplements. One is what's the function and what is the timeline. And for no cost extension, the timeline is a 1 year timeline. And that first no cost extension is really easy. It's kind of built in, it's a built-in mechanism. It comes like almost as an automatic approval. But I think Osley was talking to you about what she looks for in no cost extensions, right?
Mm-hmm. And so she did kind of confirm that first no cost extension happens through your institution. And then NSF gets a notification about the request for the no cost extension. So that approval process is different than, say, if you need a second no cost extension, a second additional year where you have to write in and actually get approval from NSF for that second no cost extension. But separate from, or in addition to that sort of technical thinking about no cost extensions, if there is funding left over, one of the things that Osley mentioned is having a clear spend out plan. So how are you intending to spend out the funds as it is connected to the project activities that you initially proposed?
That's the key, right? It's not just like we're going to go have a conference in Bermuda.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Although that does sound lovely.
It does sound lovely, and maybe you can make some kind of justification about how it helps you meet your project goals, but that might get the fisheye from the program officers. So be careful with that idea.
Mhm.
Okay, so those are no cost extensions. What about supplements, Terrell? What do we need to know about supplements?
So supplements for me came in from another rumor, right? Because initially I had heard this rumor around like 20% and budgets and like how you might be able to modify your budget up to 20%. But it turns out that that 20% rule that I had heard was actually connected to supplements. And so one of the things that Osley had shared was that if you are pursuing a supplement, again, looking to create or explore something new that is added to your project. No, not new.
No, you can't do new work. You can't do different work. It has to be, supplement has to still be within the framework of the project goals.
Yes. So yes, yes. New in a sense that like there's something that you noticed that I guess you can explore a little further.
I see. Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So it's allowing you to go deeper, but it still has to be within the framework of the project
yes.
goals. But you can't say, ooh, look over here, here's a new project, and
Yes.
sort of use the supplement mechanism as a way of pursuing a new line of inquiry or meeting new goals. So that word new needs a lot of like
nuance
and precision, I think.
Yes. And I appreciate you clarifying that with me because we don't want anybody saying, well, Terrell and Lani said that we could do
No.
this.
They were the POs were really clear that the priority in both the no cost extensions and the supplements is that these are mechanisms to help you complete the work you've proposed.
Mm-hmm.
And there are reasons why people might need a supplement that, you know, like I am going to have a project meeting with our budget person next week because our research assistant stipends have gone up, which I'm really glad about. But now I have to make sure that my current budget is going to allow for it. And if not, then that might be a reason for a supplement, just as one example. Sometimes inflation is unexpected. Sometimes I think what you were getting at, Terrell, is that you're exploring a topic and you realize you need to drill down into something that may require more time in the field, additional interviews, which means more transcription, which means more analysis, but you're doing it under the umbrella of your original project.
Yes. And that has been my experience with supplements under the umbrella and under the activities. But now you saw in completing that activity, there was additional support that's needed to really unpack and explore and understand a component connected to it.
Okay. Well,
but connected to that, though, was that 20% in a sense that for a supplemental request, 20% is, of course, always there's caveats, but 20% is the presumed maximum of your initial award that you could ask for in a supplemental request.
Right. So you don't have to ask for the full 20% because maybe the additional work you need is only going to be a portion, like 10% increase or something, or maybe a 5% increase, but you can't ask for more than 20%.
If you do ask, because I have had this before, then it actually has to go back out for external review. And it's almost like having a whole new proposal.
Oh, wow. So then, okay, well, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but okay, that's good to know. I've never had that experience, so good to know.
But yes, so that's what I've learned in terms of supplements, which I think is important as we talked about, like you're in the field, you're collecting the data, and you're running into challenges because you might need some additional support to really understand or complete a particular activity.
So did Osley have any final thoughts? It was really a gift for us to be able to spend this time with these experienced program officers. And I just want to know if she dropped any extra little pearls along the way that we want to share with whoever made it to the end of this episode.
Whoever made it to the end, yes. Now the end is near. No, not quite.
No more songs. We said
no more songs. We said it. I know, I couldn't help myself. She did. And I think it's a pearl that people don't think about, but is also very intentional. And she was just like, make sure that you're spending your money. There's a lot of bureaucracies to how NSF is structured, as it is a congressional mandate, and
Right.
as budgets are created yearly that's connected to Congress. And so, being intentional to spend your money is very important as you're thinking about completing your work. So I think that that's that pearl. Like, some people
Yeah.
may think, oh, let me save, save, save. And then I get to the end of this project and now I have all of this money left over. If you don't spend it and your project is complete, that money goes back to NSF, and NSF does not want to have to receive any money back.
Okay. That's an interesting little political angle that people may not understand, because I know in my own personal life, if I like allocate money and make a budget and I underspend, I'm usually delighted with myself.
Mm-hmm.
That's money to put in the bank, but NSF is not a bank.
It is not a bank.
My takeaway is here. Well, Toya was, again, I think, with her extensive experience working with nonprofits and community organizations and so on, she really wanted to emphasize the different timeline of submissions that NSF has compared to other organizations. She wanted prospective PIs and newcomers to NSF to recognize that it could take up to 6 months before an award is made. So you can't submit a proposal in March and think that you're going to have money to start a summer program. So people really need to think about, when they're making their proposals, to think that they're thinking at least 6 months out, if not a little bit longer, which I know a lot of folks who work in schools are not used to thinking on that long of a timeline, but that's the NSF's timeline. So be prepared for that and don't be surprised by it.
And if I could add just my own personal experience to that, because I've even submitted things in like January, right, thinking that I would be able to do something over the summer. And in my experience, even in submitting in like January, projects wouldn't get started. And when I say started, I meant my institution has received that first check,
Right.
and now I can actually start to spend money.
Yes.
They don't tend to get started until the fall. Now,
Yeah.
obviously, there's all kinds of caveats, and institutions have different policies, and there's different transfer processes. But I think in terms of like boots on the ground, getting my project started, that 6 months is important to consider, and maybe even a little additional.
Yeah.
In
I'd
terms
even
of
buffer
like
that a little
academic
bit more.
calendars.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I think that kind of points back, it circles us back to the theme of this whole season of breaking through the bureaucracy, is that when you're getting federal grants, there is a lot of bureaucracy involved. So even after you've gotten notified of the award, the money doesn't just appear like that. There is a lot of different kinds of levels of process to get the money transferred to your institutions. I know that in my university, we have to go through another set of processes to get like a account set up with an account number so that we can start spending out of that account. So there's layers and layers of things that need to happen before an award can be made active. So I think that 6 months is like a pretty good starting place. And if you want to be even more careful, a little bit longer.
And if I could just add one more thing before we do our final recap, as you're thinking about your organizations, I think it's important to check in with them to see, like, what is that policy around the spending? Because again, I love the fact that you said NSF is not a bank. Once your institution gets that money, does your institution operate from a perspective where you're technically spending money and then the institution is now deducting it from NSF at a later date? Are you actually spending the money as NSF is giving the money? Or is there other kinds of mechanisms in place? And I know that I've worked with community-based organizations and partners where there was this expectation that money is just automatically given, and now they can deduct it from a bank account, when in some spaces you actually have to pre-spend and then invoice back. And so really just understanding your institution's politics around how that spending process happens is very important, especially if you're going to be a new awardee. And again, you're operating from old schemas in terms of your own personal life or
Right.
different sort of funding institutions.
All right, ready to recap?
I am. So
All right.
going back through this episode, as we're talking about budgets, you know, the first thing that we really talked about, which you will hear NSF repeat over and over and over again, is to always check with the guidelines. That's the PAPG, PAPBG, the program solicitation, and then even more specifically, the program officer. Any questions, any comments, any confusion that you have around those spaces, you can always go back to those 3 different NSF specific entities to really help you engage with and answer your specific questions. We talked about allocating of time and money, and what is that formula that you're using, and how are you being transparent about your formula as you're thinking about personnel support, as you're thinking about how much personnel to have, how you're accounting for the time that they're spending, the difference in participant support and personnel support, and where you're allocating funds based off of if a person is participating in programming versus a person participating in research.
And it's really important to use your budget justification to explain the logics of these expenditures and its connection specifically to your project and its goals. So that is where I think of the budget justification as being kind of like the connective tissue between your proposed work and your budget. So there should be some clear connections made, and like people should be able to draw a direct line toward the activities you talk about in your proposal and how you're going to support those activities through your budget.
Which goes back to then that next thing that we really talked about in terms of the challenges. One, making sure that you're using your NSF budget templates, that you're checking in with those NSF budget webinars that are offered, and that, again, you're explaining the difference between what's personnel costs, what's participant support costs, what is travel, what is resources and materials, and it is very clear, it is very explicit how you're doing that work in your budget justification, recognizing that NSF loves participant support. We really want to lean into that for sure.
And post-award to really be mindful of when you are shifting budget lines from one category to another. If your budget needs moving, especially away from salaries or participant costs, you need to reach out to your program officers to make sure that you are doing it in an above board way. You need approval from the NSF to be able to reallocate funding in that particular way. If you have any questions, it is easy enough to reach out to the program officers with any specific needs or questions. Also to remember that your annual report is a place to talk about any discrepancies that you might have between your projected spending and your actual spending, and to always connect the project activities to the budget as it's playing out.
And then the last sort of things, we have a lot of bullet points this time.
Yeah.
Is really thinking about the difference between no cost extensions and supplementals, recognizing that both have to be connected to completion of your initial project activities, where no cost extensions are approved through your institutions that first year. And then that second year has to be approved with NSF prior to any institutional approval. And supplements are maximum awards can be 20% of your initial budget requested. And those activities have to be very clear as to how and why these additional funds connect back to completing your initial project within the scope that you have proposed.
Right. And the other thing to remember about the difference between no cost extensions and supplements is the time that is allocated by each of these mechanisms. No cost extensions give you an additional year, whereas supplements give you another 6 months. I think we did it, Terrell.
I think we did.
I don't know that we were
NSF
faster.
is not a bank because that's just another mic drop moment. But I love it though.
Well, anyway, it's always fun to talk to you. We know this was a really nuts and bolts conversation, but we hope it helps you think about your budgets and how to develop them and the relationship between budgets and proposals and all those things. So good luck to you all.
Yes, take care. Be sure to follow us. Be sure to continue to check in with the resources offered by Cadre. So the links will be provided below and shared with you before. And thank you, Osley. Thank you, Toya, for your words of wisdom and insight. This podcast vlog thing that we do would not have been beneficial or great without you.
Yes, we really benefited a lot. I learned a ton from these conversations. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.